And I would say that there's two stages to this. We've got to think about getting those building blocks in place. The market is going to scale, but it's relatively small now. Ultimately, it's going to get bigger. And what's one of the challenges for all countries is managing your Article 6 strategy and policy. Now, unfortunately, I missed Josh's presentation yesterday, but I'm sure that was part of it. Because every time you send an ITMO offshore to another country, you have to do another project to add it in. So you've got to do a balancing act. And you've got to think about how you manage the additional emissions reductions you now have to achieve because you've sold an emission reduction. This is the corresponding adjustments. But what I would suggest is that you do this on a two-stage basis. Get the nuts and bolts, open for business. Come up with a defined list of projects where you know you can basically start issuing ITMOs. Put a cap on it if you need to. But don't try and do everything at once, because to put in a long-term Article 6 policy, you're going to need to do a marginal abatement cost curve. You're going to have to do that graph for everything in Zimbabwe. You're going to have to basically come up with what is your long-term decarbonisation strategy, and you're going to price that up. And that's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of capacity. You're going to have to do the socio-economic and sustainable development analysis. You're going to have to basically coordinate between all the ministries, because you can't have one ministry in charge of basically what is good and what is bad from a credit perspective, and then telling the agriculture ministry, well, you can't do that anymore, and you can't do that anymore. It's got to be multi-stakeholder. But what I would suggest is that get going with a pilot. Get a sort of pilot policy going, which you know you're going to refine over time when you do all the strategy documents and you think it through. But get some scores on the board. Show you're open for business, show you can implement. And then you've got to think about policies to get this thing moving. So governments are not the best placed actors to actually implement policies, implement projects and activities. Your job is to put together the environment and incentivize the private sector to put in the right projects. And that private sector needs support. And it needs, and that private sector, there's lots of different actors in that private sector. And if you look at Article 6, which is where I mean that has the biggest potential. It's being implemented, it's a G to G at the top, but it's being implemented B to B. And you have to make sure that those businesses have the support, the regulation is clear, and that you are sort of making it an enabling environment. And some of the key elements of that are certainty, policy certainty. Obviously, a country's capacity to mitigate emissions is a national asset. It comes from your natural capital, it comes from your renewable energy resources. These are national assets, and the government has to be interested. The government has an interest, and it should be able to participate in the monetization of that national asset. But it's got to be done in the same way as we look at mineral wealth. There's no point putting a massive tax on something if you're never going to get any investment. A large tax rate on a small amount is not as good as a smaller tax rate on a large amount. And right now, if you go back to that original slide where you saw the buyers and the sellers, it's a bit of a buyer's market, and capital is mobile. And that's capital from project developers who are willing to establish projects here, and they do have expertise. We need to home grow our project development, but we also will need to basically bring in foreign project developers. That capital is mobile. Funding capital is mobile. Because where we need to get to, we need to turn this, if we're going to turn this into the export commodity that I mentioned at the start, you're going to have to scale that. Right now, projects are funded on the whole by prepayments by buyers and sort of equity capital. To scale it, we need banks to come in. And in order for banks to come in, we've got to find ways to de-risk it and for banks to play in that. And that means long-term policy certainty and an enabling environment. And that capital is mobile. It'll go to other countries. We've got to have the right policy environment. You've got to have user-friendly tax systems. You've got to make sure that, obviously we have to make sure that communities are equitably rewarded for their participation, because they're the ones that make this thing happen. And government has rightfully got a stake in this, and we've got to make sure it's right. But it's got to be, you're competing against countries like Ghana and Rwanda, who effectively said, Ghana's saying, I'll charge $5 for an ITMO. That's it. clear, not going to change it. Once you're signed up, done. Rwanda's saying, I'm not going to charge. The foreign direct is going to bring the foreign direct investment in, that will be benefit for us because we'll earn the tax revenues on the projects, on the taxes. It's, you've got to create this enabling environment where project developers go, you know what, I want to set up my project, I want to set up I want to set up in Zimbabwe. And banks like my bank go, you know what, I know I can fund this because I know that there's legislative and policy certainty. I know exactly what the cash flows are going to be. Because these are like project financing transactions, they're long term. And ultimately, we need policy certainty in order to make sure we can scale this. And I think that's my last slide. Yes. Okay. I hope that was useful. And I'm very happy to take any questions. Yes? If I've got time to take questions.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I have a quick question. From the buyer's side, what are you looking for in terms of a high quality project? Are there certain check boxes? Because I know that a lot of buyers in the corporate world are looking for much more than just a proven carbon reduction. What are the other additional aspects that you're seeking?
Okay. Standard Bank is actually not, we're effectively an intermediary, so I talk to the buyers and I talk to what they want. There are certain themes that are coming through, and you've got to think about which buyers in which markets. So if I look at South African market, we've got the carbon tax there, and carbon tax payers can offset a portion of their taxable emissions, reduce their tax bill with eligible carbon credits. They just care it's eligible. That means it's up to the South African government to set the quality rules. But if it's eligible and it fits in that bucket, people will buy it. They're not too worried. They don't dig deeper. And I imagine that's the way it's going to go with some of these other compliance systems. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then you look at sort of the other end of the spectrum, which is where you have corporates who are buying purely to fulfill their voluntary decarbonisation commitments. And this is a story. They're putting it in their sustainability report. So Microsoft is a good example. They made a commitment to be net zero in all of their operations by 2013 to offset all of their emissions from when they were first formed in 1975 by 2050. So they're out there buying carbon credits in significant numbers. They retired 5 million tonnes last year. But they have such strict criteria. It has to be removals. No avoidance credits. It has to be removals. You have to clearly demonstrate the contributions and to the communities who are involved. You have to sort of tick a whole bunch of sustainable development boxes, and then you can be accepted into their program. But they pay well because it goes into it's part of their brand. I've been talking to other buyers. I talked to a buyer yesterday morning, and he was saying, I've got a mark. I want 2 million tonnes over the next 5-6 years, and slightly 7-8 years. I only want removals, but I'm only paying $10. That's a real challenge. So, they're all different. Other buyers will only buy nature-based solutions in their value chain. But generally, the common themes that are coming through are people are leaning more towards removals, although they don't like the price. But quality is really important, and even better if somebody else has vouched for the quality. So this is why this is the core carbon principles. I think will be a very good addition to the voluntary carbon market, because now you'll be able to buy a carbon credit and say, well, you know what? Even if it turned out to be trash, it's got this little label on it. Or you look at the rating agencies like BZero and Silvera, they're like Moody's and S&P for carbon credits, and they assess the credit rating, the environmental integrity rating of a carbon credit. People want to rely on somebody else. So, if it's eligible for Corsia, I'll buy it. If it's eligible for the Singaporean carbon tax, I'll buy it because we rely on Singapore to do their homework. So, people are looking for quality. They're not quite, the impression I get, they're not quite ready to pay for it yet, but they're going to have to. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Lawrence. Sorry, I'll stir in the mic here. You might have answered the question already, but are there any entities on this continent buying credits?
Very few, very, very few. And if you look at, and a good sort of gauge to the climate ambitions of corporates on this continent is if you go to the Science Based Targets Initiative website and search under Africa. Last time I did, I think there are now something like 7,000 companies globally that have signed up to the Science Based Targets. And the last time I checked, which was admittedly a few months ago, about 30 or 40 of them were in Africa. So there will be some. I mean, I'm talking to the retailers in South Africa about carbon credits, but on the whole, it's, you know, this is a source of supply rather than demand. And then, but in South Africa, with that the carbon tax offset system, there's a pool of demand, and then you cannot get enough. There's not enough credits in South Africa to supply that demand. And as of the World Bank did a stage of trends of the carbon markets report recently, and they're indicating that Botswana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, I think, and Egypt are all looking at carbon pricing mechanisms, probably carbon tax, and there could well be another offset element in there to effectively help industry meet their emissions targets, and that will create little pockets of demand.
Thank you, Lawrence. You mentioned that the private sector is looking forward to certain things on the part of government. You talked about policy consistency, policy certainty, clear regulations. You also talked about the operating environment, which must be conducive. My question is, what is the pledge of the private sector to the government? How best can you convince those who represent the government that the private sector is genuine, is meaning good to the people and to the planet as well? How can the government be enticed or convinced that the private sector this time around is going to be friendly also to the interest of the people? Because the government, they are there to represent the people, but over the years we have seen the private sector being also accused of leaving a trail of environmental damages. What is the pledge of the private sector to the government and to the planet? Thank you.
I think like every industry, it's going to be a partnership. They need to work together. And I'm certainly not saying that there haven't been bad actors in the carbon credit space. Regulation is a really important element to make sure that people are obeying the rules. Absolutely, we must make sure that the government has a role to play to regulate this. And if the private sector can't play by the rules, they shouldn't play here. But at the same time, those rules have to be such that the private sector can play, and the private sectors are not philanthropists, and there never will be. This is ultimately the only reason Article 6 is ever going to work is because of greed. People will basically want to make sure that they're doing things and that they're getting the most for their buck. Private sector is the same, but they've got to basically be controlled like any other. I mean, think of it, just look at it the same way as you look at your mining industry. You need them. They generate tax dollars. They basically employ people. But at the same time, they damage the environment. They can be exploitive to the workers. And you've got to make sure that your regulations are in place to ensure that they don't damage the environment and they clean up their mess, that they are fair to their workers. And I think it's exactly the same with this industry. The problem with this industry is that because of the way it grew up, it's completely unregulated. And that invites some bad actors. But there are that, unfortunately, as we've seen, a few bad actors can really spoil the story. But there are a lot of really good people here who are trying to do a good job, and will want to play by the rules and want to be regulated because that gives them the legitimacy.
Okay, thank you very much for an enlightening presentation. And I caught you saying that the private sector should be incentivized. And when you're also when you're also speaking about regulation, I decided to check what type of regulations we have in Zimbabwe. And I realized that we've got SI 158 of 2023. But when I went through it, I realized that it's a bit vague. And I have a question for the parliamentarians and those who've been in the carbon credit business on how far they've gone to have an act in place that clearly outlines the carbon credits business and regulation, like you're speaking about. And if we do not have an act in place, is there a bill in place? If it is in place, what role is the private sector also played to ensure that they input into that bill, so as to also ensure that the environment will be favorable for their operations? Thank you.
I'm very pleased to say I'm not answering that question.
Thank you so much. The reason why we are here and the reason why we had to bring the portfolio committee on environment, they belong, it's environment, climate, wildlife, tourism, etc., etc. Is because it's exactly that. The SI was enacted by the executive and it's temporary. And the context within which the executive, the Ministry of Environment in particular, promulgated that was a reactive approach after the Kariba Red project issues came into light. So the reaction first was a null and void proclamation by the Minister of Environment, where all carbon credit projects in Zimbabwe were declared null and void. What then followed was then the enactment of SI 150 of 2023. But it was more or less reactive. And if you looked at that SI, it's changed. Particularly there are clauses that were changed, I think 3 times. First 30, 70, and then, so, that's the reason why we then had to say, can we have, now then there was, of course, there is a move towards an enactment of the climate change bill, which is why the honorable members of parliament are here, so that they get an understanding of what we are talking about, so that when they are debating in parliament, they come up with a bill that will be a win-win kind of a bill. And we expect, I'm happy they've been already there. I can see the honorable members were already contributing. They seem to be now seeing the way forward. And these are the people that are carrying us, Lawrence. The honorable members here are carrying the future of the carbon markets in Zimbabwe. Because if the bill, the law, that's the Climate Change Act, is enacted in such a, and it comes up that it's stifling, for example, investment or drives away investment. As Lawrence said, he said some very important point, that capital is fluid and capital can run away from Zimbabwe. And it is the certainty of the legislative framework that it either kills the industry or attracts investment. So, honorable members of parliament, I'm sure we could still be engaged more, you more as private sector, to say, in as much as we understand the issues or the concerns of government and the desire to regulate the markets, which is a good thing, by the way, because the markets had gone for a long time unregulated and bad apples emerged. But there must be a balance between regulation and also the need to allow the sector to thrive without undue interference. For example, Lawrence talked about the issue of tax. He said, give an example where Rwanda will say, Ghana will say, we'll take $5, and Rwanda will say, no, we will not take anything because this amounts to foreign direct investment. So it's up to you legislators to then say, weigh the options. And as private sector, we are available for consultation. We are available together with civil society to say, let's develop a framework that ensures, number one, that climate change mitigation happens in Zimbabwe. Number two, that ensures that the communities that are being affected by climate change benefit from the climate finance. Number three, that ensures that private sector and business, remember people put money into carbon credits projects, they also thrive, so that there is a win-win-win-win situation. So we're looking up to the honorable MPs. Please, we are available, and not just to go around to communities, but to engage on it. In fact, the activist in me thinks that we should start coming up with a policy monograph to help in terms of guiding you during your debates. At least you have benchmarks, some document that you take to Parliament when you are debating. Because without that, the executive might want to, to grab the space, and that will kill the space and push the capital away from Zimbabwe.